2000, the beginning of a millennium. The 90s were quite a successful time for Americans. Bill Clinton was the president at this point in time, and he had already served 2 terms, being elected in 1992, beating President George H.W. Bush, and in 1996, beating Republican Bob Dole. Both of these elections had a huge landslide for the Democrats, which wasn't even at all surprising due to the fact that the House had been prominently Democrat for quite some time, and the Senate was also Democrat since the Reagan era. Some successes that President Clinton had included the Oslo Accords, which guaranteed peace for Palestine and Israel. However, Clinton also did great for the economy. The tech deal was a big part of that. All sorts of new businesses started rising up, many businesses that would end up making billions of dollars. However, conservatives still complained about Clinton having a very liberal stance on things. This led to the 1994 midterm elections not doing too good for the Democrats' favor, ending up with Republicans taking back not only the Senate, but also the House. Republicans did not have control over the House of Representatives since the 1950s, and although there were scandals about Bill Clinton and his intern,
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
Well, turns out he did have sexual relations with that woman, and this ended up to him being the second president in American history to ever be impeached by the Senate. However, there was no conviction, therefore Bill Clinton would continue running his second term, which he would finish strong with a 66% approval rating. However, which Democrat was going to continue his legacy? The main runner-up was Vice President Al Gore. Gore was a solid choice, considering the fact that he was well-educated and very experienced in politics. He also took efforts to fight climate change and global warming, which really appealed to progressive liberals. Gore's only actual competition in the primaries was none other than Bill Bradley, a former U.S. Senator from New Jersey. But as expected, Al Gore won the primaries easily. Gore's running mate would be none other than Joe Lieberman, a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Republicans, however, were going to have a slightly bigger struggle in this election. After all, Republicans have lost to Democrats the last 2 times in major landslides. Also, both Clinton and Gore were generally liked by the public. So when it came to the Republican primaries, the main options were George W. Bush, governor of Texas and son of former President George H.W. Bush and brother of Florida Governor Jeb Bush, John McCain, a U.S. Senator from Arizona, and Alan Keyes, a conservative activist and diplomat. McCain seemed a bit too moderate, and Keyes seemed a bit too far-right, so Republicans inevitably went with Bush, being the safest option, considering the fact that the Bush family was relatively the ones who were controlling the Republican Party at this point in time. Young Bush decided to make his running mate none other than Dick Cheney. Cheney was a safe choice, considering he had a lot of experience in politics, not only being a congressman for quite a few years, but also serving as Bush Sr.'s Secretary of Defense. Now, Bush and Gore were quite different on almost every issue. Bush was big on cutting taxes all across the board, as Gore supported targeted tax cuts, being very careful and using the budget surplus to pay down the national debt. One of the biggest key talking points was none other than Social Security. Bush supported partial privatization and allowing younger workers to invest a portion of their payroll taxes in personal accounts. Gore, however, opposed privatization and planned on using surplus to strengthen the traditional system. Both highly supported education, as Bush would later be known for the No Child Left Behind approach, as Gore supported more federal funding for teachers, school construction, and smaller class sizes. When it came to healthcare, Bush took a typical conservative stance with more market-oriented solutions, some expansion of coverage though, as Gore wanted even more coverage under Medicare and broader access. But one of Gore's biggest talking talking points was none other than global warming. He wanted strong early focus on climate change, as he feared that in the next 12 years, the Earth would be completely warmed up, with no ice caps ever in the world. Now here we are in 2026, where Antarctica gained some ice layers, but we don't talk about that. Republicans genuinely liked George Bush Jr. much more than George Bush Sr., as George W. Bush seemed to be much more conservative when it came to handling domestic issues. Although Bush would be mocked some, Bush would play it right back at Al Gore for even attacking his personal stances on being the divine savior who invented the internet.
During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
As I'm sure you can imagine, many memes were made of this. Even Bush himself decided to join in on the fun.
He's a good campaigner and he's got a lot of confidence. So much so that he thinks he invented the internet.
A lot of the reason that Bush was able to gain so much support was because of the name. The name of this new upcoming conservative family political dynasty. It is also worth mentioning that Gore and Bush were not the only ones running in this election. There was a third candidate, Ralph Nader of the Green Party. The Green Party, much like Al Gore, had a tough stance on fighting climate change. But how did this actual election go? Surprisingly to many, it was a pretty close race. In fact, it was one of the closest elections in American history. Now, for starters, Gore would easily win the West Coast, along with Hawaii. Bush would easily take Alaska, along with the majority of the West. Not all of the West, though, as Gore would be able to sweep New Mexico. Bush, however, as many conservatives did, won a good hold of the Midwest, with, of course, his conservative home state of Texas. Gore, however, dominated many of the more northern Midwestern states, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, which happened to be the ones that gained the most electoral votes. As the Southern conservative that Bush was, he got the majority of the South, even Gore's home state of Tennessee. The northeastern states voted Democrat almost anonymously, although New Hampshire was still conservative enough to go for Bush. Now all that was left was Florida. Now the 25 electoral votes that Florida was worth was going to be enough to secure either one's election. Now Bush ended up winning Florida by a few hundred votes. However, there were problems with the ballots. Some punch card ballots had partially punched holes. This made it unclear who the person was actually voting for. Gore kept calling for recounts. However, the recount happened a few times until eventually it went to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court decided to stop the recounts, and Florida was won by none other than George Walker Bush. This gave Bush just over the 270 electoral votes to win the election. Although Gore was very upset about the results, he gave a very honorable concession speech.
Be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
So on January 20th, 2001, George Walker Bush was sworn in as the 43rd President of the United States.